The boy begged his neighbors for help, but no one expected the heartbreaking truth behind his plea. Jacob's life was not the kind most kids his age lived. At 12 years old, he had already seen more than his share of hardship. His father had walked out when he was just a toddler, leaving his mother to raise him and his little sister, Emily, on her own. She worked long hours at a diner on the edge of town, often coming home too tired to do much more than collapse onto the couch. That left Jacob to pick up the slack, cooking meals, helping Emily with her homework, and keeping the little apartment they called home somewhat in order. But even with Jacob's efforts, life wasn't easy. Their neighborhood wasn't the safest. Gunshots and sirens at night were common, and Jacob knew to keep Emily away from the windows when things got loud. The neighbors mostly kept to themselves, locking their doors tight and pretending not to notice the struggles around them. It was a place where everyone seemed to believe in fending for themselves. Jacob tried to make the best of things. He wasn't much for complaining. His mother had enough on her plate, and Emily looked up to him like he could fix anything. But deep down, the weight of everything he carried sometimes felt unbearable. There were nights when he'd lie awake staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering why their lives had to be so hard. He clutched the small silver locket his grandfather had given him before he passed away, finding a strange kind of comfort in its worn edges. That locket was the only thing Jacob had left of his grandfather, a man who had always told him to be strong, no matter what. "You've got a fire in you, Jacob," his grandfather had said once. "When things get tough, you fight back. That's what this family does." So, Jacob fought. He fought to keep Emily safe, to make his mother proud, and to hold on to some shred of hope. But as strong as he tried to be, even he couldn't have predicted the storm that was about to sweep through their fragile lives. It had been a regular evening, or so it seemed. Jacob had walked Emily home from school, just like always, and made her favorite grilled cheese for dinner. Their mother had left for her night shift, leaving them alone in the small apartment. Emily was sitting cross-legged on the couch, humming a tune while coloring in her sketchbook, a habit that always brought her calm. For a moment, things almost felt peaceful. But peace never lasted long for them. Around 8 p.m., the power went out. The sudden darkness startled Emily, who let out a small yelp. "It's just the power," Jacob reassured her, lighting the old battery-operated lantern they kept under the sink. He tried to smile, though he couldn't shake a bad feeling creeping in the back of his mind. He had noticed it earlier that day, a man standing across the street from their apartment building, watching. He hadn't thought much of it at first, but now the memory felt sharper. He glanced out the window, but all he could see was rain starting to drizzle under the dim glow of the streetlights. Jacob locked the door, just in case, and tried to focus on keeping Emily calm. "Why don't you finish your drawing?" he suggested, though his tone betrayed his unease. Before long, the drizzle turned into a full-blown storm. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked so loudly that it made the apartment shake. Emily, now curled up on the couch, clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly. "Jacob, can we call Mom?" she asked in a small voice. "We'll be fine," Jacob said, though his hands were trembling as he reached for the locket in his pocket. It had always been his source of courage, and he needed it now more than ever. Then came the sound that made his blood run cold, a loud, deliberate knock at the door. Jacob froze. No one knocked on their door at this hour. Not in their neighborhood. His heart pounded as he gestured for Emily to stay quiet. "Don't move," he whispered, creeping toward the door. "Jacob," a voice called from the other side. It wasn't a stranger, it was one of their neighbors, Mr. Reed. Relief flooded Jacob for a moment, but it didn't last. Mr. Reed's voice was urgent, panicked. "Jacob, is your sister with you? I just saw someone heading toward the building. You need to stay inside." Jacob's breath caught. He turned back to Emily, who was now clutching the stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles were white. Whoever Mr. Reed had seen, Jacob knew one thing: they weren't safe. His mind raced. He couldn't leave Emily alone, but staying put didn't feel safe either. He double-checked the locks on the door, then dragged the small bookshelf in front of it for extra security. Listen to me," he said, kneeling in front of her. "We're going to stay right here together. Whatever happens, I'll keep you safe." Emily nodded, her wide eyes full of fear, but trusting him completely. Jacob sat beside her, gripping the locket in his hand and praying that whatever was coming wouldn't make it through their door. The storm raged on, howling against the windows and rattling the thin walls of the apartment. Jacob sat on the floor beside Emily, the small lantern casting faint, flickering light across the room. The stuffed rabbit lay limply in her arms as she leaned into Jacob, seeking comfort in his presence. For a while, there was only the sound of the rain and thunder. But then Jacob heard something else, a noise that made his stomach churn. It was faint at first, just a dull scrape, like metal against metal. His eyes darted toward the door, where the bookshelf he had pushed stood as their only added barrier. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the storm. Jacob didn't answer. He motioned for her to stay quiet and got to his feet, his bare toes sinking into the worn carpet. Slowly he approached the door, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would give them away. The sound came again, louder this time. A distinct, deliberate noise. Someone was trying to pick the lock. "Emily, go to the closet," he said, forcing calm into his voice as he turned to look at her. Her eyes widened in terror, but she obeyed, clutching the rabbit tightly as she crawled into the small hallway closet and closed the door behind her. Jacob stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. He couldn't call the police. His mom's phone was the only one they had, and she'd taken it to work. The neighbors rarely involved themselves in other people's business, and he couldn't risk opening the door to check who it was. He clutched the locket around his neck, feeling its cool, familiar weight against his skin. "Come on, Grandpa," he muttered under his breath. "What would you do?" Suddenly, the noise stopped. Jacob's breath caught as he stared at the door, his entire body tense. For a moment, he thought maybe whoever it was had given up. But then came another sound, a heavy, deliberate knock, followed by a voice that sent shivers down his spine. Jacob opened the door. It wasn't Mr. Reed this time. The voice was low, gravelly, and completely unfamiliar. Jacob took a step back, his eyes darting to the windows. Could they escape that way? No, the fire escape was on the other side of the building, and Emily would never make it down the slippery metal stairs in this weather. The doorknob jiggled, and Jacob's panic surged. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a heavy rusted wrench his mom had left near the heater, and held it tightly, his knuckles white. If they got through the door, he wasn't going to let them get to Emily. "Jacob," the voice came again, now with a hint of amusement, as if the person on the other side knew exactly how scared he was. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just open the door." The thunder outside boomed louder, and for a split second, the lantern's light flickered out. When it came back, Jacob's heart skipped a beat. A shadow moved across the crack under the door. Whoever they weren't leaving any time soon. Jacob's grip tightened on the wrench as the voice outside the door grew more persistent. The intruder knocked again, louder this time, the sound echoing through the small apartment. "Jacob," the voice called, dripping with a false calm. "I know you're in there. I saw the light. Open the door, kid. I'm not here to hurt you." Jacob's breathing quickened. He wasn't buying it. Everything in his gut screamed that whoever was out there wasn't here for anything good. He glanced toward the hallway closet where Emily was hiding, the door barely ajar. He could see her big eyes peeking through the crack, wide with fear. He raised his hand in a calming gesture, silently promising her it would be okay. But deep down, he wasn't sure it would. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, and the sound of metal scraping against the lock sent a shiver down his spine. The storm outside howled, drowning out everything but his pounding heartbeat. He needed to think fast. The locket pressed against his chest as he moved, its weight grounding him. "Be smart," he muttered to himself, hearing his grandfather's voice in his mind. "When things feel impossible, think like the fire. You burn through." His eyes darted around the room. The door wouldn't hold much longer, but if the intruder got inside, they needed a way to escape. The windows were too risky. The only other exit was through the back stairwell, but they'd have to make a run for it, and they'd need a distraction to buy time. Jacob's gaze landed on the gas stove in the small kitchen. An idea sparked in his mind, dangerous, but their only chance. He moved quickly, turning the knobs just enough to let the gas hiss out into the air. Not too much, just enough to give him leverage. He grabbed a pack of matches from the counter and stuffed them into his pocket. The voice outside grew angrier. "I don't have all night, kid." A loud thud hit the door, and Jacob realized they were trying to kick it down. He had seconds, maybe less. He ran to the closet and opened the door just enough to whisper to Emily. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We're going to leave through the back stairs, okay? I need you to stay as quiet as you can. Hold my hand, no matter what. Can you do that? Emily nodded, her little face pale and terrified. What about the person at the door? Jacob hesitated but forced a small smile. I'll take care of it. Just stay with me. He helped her out of the closet, keeping her behind him as they crept toward the back of the apartment. Jacob's heart raced as he grabbed the wrench again, tucking it into his belt. He turned the corner toward the back door, but before they reached it, a deafening crash came from behind. The front door splintered open, and heavy footsteps echoed into the apartment. Go, Jacob hissed, pushing Emily toward the back exit. He lit a match behind him and tossed it toward the stove. It sparked to life, a small burst of flame catching as he slammed the door to the back stairwell shut behind him. The last thing he heard before they ran into the storm was the voice shouting in frustration, followed by the hiss of the gas catching fire. Jacob's lungs burned as he sprinted down the dark stairwell. Emily's small hand clutched tightly in his. The cold, damp air smelled of mildew, and every creak of the old steps sent a jolt of fear through him. Behind them, he could still hear faint shouting from their apartment, though the storm outside muffled most of it. Keep going, Jacob urged, his voice barely audible over the pounding of their footsteps. Emily didn't say a word, but her breathing was ragged, and he knew she was struggling to keep up. The stairwell opened into the alley behind their building, where the rain poured in sheets, soaking them instantly. Jacob paused for a split second, scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. The narrow alley was dark, except for the occasional flicker of a streetlight at the far end. Where are we going? Emily finally whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob knelt down to her level, his hand still gripping hers. We just need to get far enough away, he said. There's a place, Mr. Reed's apartment. He'll help us. Emily nodded, trusting him completely, though tears glistened in her wide eyes. Before they could move, a sound from behind froze Jacob in place. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the stairwell they had just escaped. Jacob's stomach dropped. He grabbed Emily's hand again and bolted toward the street. The rain lashed at their faces, and the wind roared in their ears as they ran. Jacob's sneakers splashed through puddles, soaking his socks, but he didn't dare stop. He knew whoever was following them was close, and he couldn't let them get to Emily. As they reached the end of the alley, Jacob made the mistake of glancing over his shoulder. The figure was there, barely visible in the dim light. The man's face was obscured by a hood, but there was no mistaking his purpose. He was hunting them. Jacob's heart raced as he yanked Emily into another narrow street, weaving between trash bins and abandoned cars. Just a little farther, he promised, though he wasn't sure how much farther they could go. Finally, they reached the small courtyard outside Mr. Reed's building. Jacob pulled Emily under the overhang of the entrance and crouched beside her, both of them gasping for air. The rain continued to hammer down, masking their location for the moment. But as Jacob looked at Emily, huddled and shivering, something inside him twisted. This wasn't just about running anymore. Whoever this man was, he wasn't after random kids on a whim. There had to be a reason. Jacob's hand instinctively went to the locket around his neck, clutching it tightly. Stay here, Jacob whispered to Emily. No, she hissed back, her eyes wide with panic. I'm not leaving, Jacob assured her, glancing toward the street. I just need to figure out who he is and why he's after us. Before Emily could argue, another noise pierced the night, a loud crash of metal as the figure kicked over a trash can nearby. He was close. Too close. Jacob's mind raced. Why would someone go to such lengths? And then it hit him, the locket. His grandfather had always told him it was special, but he never explained why. Jacob had worn it every day since he was a kid, thinking it was just a memory of the man who believed in him. But what if it was more than that? He turned back to Emily, gripping her shoulders firmly. Listen to me, he said, his voice low but urgent. Whatever happens, you keep this safe. He pulled the locket from around his neck and pressed it into her small hands. Why are you giving it to me? She asked, her voice shaking. Because I think this is what he wants. Before Jacob could say more, a shadow moved across the courtyard. The man was here, and there was no time left to run. The shadow loomed closer, the man's heavy footsteps splashing through the rain-soaked courtyard. Jacob's heart thundered in his chest as he shielded Emily behind him, gripping the rusted wrench like it was the only thing standing between them and disaster. Come on, kid, the man's low voice called out, calm and deliberate. Hand it over, and this'll all be over. I don't want to hurt you. Jacob's grip tightened on the wrench, his knuckles turning white. He didn't believe a word. The man's hood obscured most of his face, but the sharpness in his voice carried a threat that couldn't be ignored. Emily whimpered softly, clutching the locket against her chest as if her life depended on it. Jacob took a step back, his mind racing. He couldn't fight this man alone, not with Emily to protect. Then it came to him. The neighbors. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Emily, then grabbed her hand and bolted toward the nearest door. He banged on it with all his might, the cold wood stinging his fists. "Help! Please, someone help us," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. For a moment, there was silence, save for the pounding rain. Jacob's heart sank as he heard the man's footsteps closing in behind them. But then the porch light flickered on, and the door opened a crack. "What's going on out here?" a tired, gruff voice asked. It was Mr. Porter, their neighbor in his 60s who was known for his no-nonsense attitude. "Please," Jacob begged, panting. "There's a man chasing us. He's trying to hurt us." I don't know why, but he's after us." Mr. Porter's eyes narrowed as he looked past Jacob to the shadowy figure approaching. "You're out here making noise for nothing, boy. It's late. Please, I'm telling the truth." Jacob interrupted, his voice breaking. "My sister, she's only 8. He's going to hurt us if you don't help." Mr. Porter hesitated, his expression hard, but before he could decide, the man's voice cut through the rain. "Don't listen to him," the intruder said, his tone eerily calm. He stepped into the light, his face partially visible now, sharp cheekbones, a jagged scar running down one side of his jaw. The kid's confused. "I just need what they took, and I'll leave." Jacob's stomach dropped. What they took? He had no idea what the man was talking about, but it was clear the locket had something to do with it. He pulled Emily closer, his eyes darting between the man and Mr. Porter. The door started to close. "I don't want trouble," Mr. Porter muttered, shaking his head. "No," Jacob cried, sticking his foot in the doorway. "You can't just shut me out. Please. My sister, she's all I have." The rawness in his voice seemed to cut through the old man's hesitation. Mr. Porter sighed, rubbing his temples. "Get inside." "No." Relief flooded Jacob as he pushed Emily into the house, but the man outside wasn't finished. "You don't know what you're getting involved in, old man," the intruder called out, his voice darker now. "That locket, it doesn't belong to them. It's mine. And if you protect them, you're making a mistake." Jacob turned back to look at the man, anger and confusion swirling in his chest. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" The man smiled, a cold, calculated expression. "Ask your grandfather, kid." "Oh, wait, you can't, can you?" Jacob froze, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. How did this man know his grandfather? And what did the locket have to do with it? Before he could respond, Mr. Porter slammed the door shut and locked it. "You've got some explaining to do, boy," he said, his voice stern. "What's this all about?" Jacob's breath caught as he looked at Emily, who clutched the locket tightly. He knew the time had come to reveal the truth, or at least, as much of it as he understood. Jacob stood in the middle of Mr. Porter's small, cluttered living room, his wet clothes dripping onto the faded carpet. Emily sat on the worn sofa, clutching the locket so tightly it seemed to disappear into her small hands. Mr. Porter stared at them both, arms crossed, his brow furrowed with a mix of annoyance and concern. "Start talking, kid," Mr. Porter said, his gruff voice cutting through the tension. "Who is that guy, and why is he after you?" Jacob hesitated, glancing at Emily, who looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. He wants this," Jacob said, gesturing to the locket in Emily's hands. "But I don't know why." Mr. Porter raised an eyebrow. "A piece of jewelry? That's what all this is about." "It's not just jewelry," Jacob said, his voice shaking. "It belonged to my grandpa. He gave it to me before he died. He said it was important, but he never told me why." Mr. Porter sighed, rubbing his temple. "And this guy outside, he mentioned your grandpa. Said something about the locket being his. You have any idea what that's about?" Jacob shook his head. "No, but I think my grandpa was hiding something. He always acted like the locket was more than it looked." He paused, the pieces starting to click together in his mind. "Before he passed away, he told me, when things feel impossible, think like the fire you burn through. I never understood what he meant until tonight. Mr. Porter frowned, his skepticism softening slightly. And you think this guy, whoever he is, knows what your grandpa was hiding? Jacob nodded. He said it doesn't belong to us. But I swear my grandpa gave it to me. It's ours, and I won't let him take it. Emily's small voice broke through the tense silence. He said Grandpa owed him something. Jacob froze, turning to Emily. What? He said Grandpa owed him, she repeated, her voice trembling. When you were yelling at the door, I heard him say he didn't pay what he owed. Jacob's chest tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. His grandfather, the man who had raised him to be strong and brave, had kept secrets. Jacob had always thought the locket was just a symbol of their bond, a reminder to stay resilient. But what if it was something more? Mr. Porter leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin. Sounds like your grandpa got mixed up in something big. Debt, maybe. Or something worse. He glanced toward the window, where the rain was still coming down in sheets. And now this guy thinks you're holding on to whatever he was owed. But it's just a locket. Jacob protested. It doesn't make sense. Not to you, maybe, Mr. Porter said. But to him, it's worth enough to chase two kids through the rain and break down your door. Jacob's stomach churned. His grandfather had always been his hero, a man of integrity, strength, and wisdom. The idea that he might have been involved in something dangerous felt like a betrayal. But there was no denying the truth anymore. Do you know who he is? Mr. Porter asked, his voice steady but serious. Jacob shook his head. No. But he said my grandpa would know. Before Mr. Porter could respond, there was a loud bang on the door. All three of them froze. Time's up, old man. The intruder's voice rang out, louder and angrier than before. Give me the kids, or I'll come in and take them. Mr. Porter stood, his face hardening as he moved toward a drawer in the corner of the room. He pulled out a shotgun, checking the barrel before slinging it over his shoulder. You two stay behind me, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jacob grabbed Emily's hand, his heart pounding. The storm outside seemed to roar louder as the man banged on the door again, the sound echoing through the house. Mr. Porter, Jacob started, his voice trembling. The old man glanced at him. We're going to get to the bottom of this, kid. But first, let's make sure he doesn't get through that door. The banging on the door grew louder, each thud echoing through the small house like a thunderclap. Jacob stood frozen, his pulse racing, while Emily clung to his side. Mr. Porter tightened his grip on the shotgun, positioning himself in front of the door with a determined look on his face. I'm giving you one warning, Mr. Porter shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. Leave now, or you'll regret it. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the pounding rain outside. Then the intruder's voice rang out, cold and venomous. You don't know what you're protecting, old man. That locket isn't just some trinket, it's the key to everything. Hand it over, and no one gets hurt. Jacob's heart sank. The key to everything. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Think like the fire you burned through. What had his grandfather been hiding? What could possibly make a simple locket so important? The door shuddered as the intruder kicked it, splinters flying from the frame. Mr. Porter raised the shotgun, his jaw set. Get back, he muttered to Jacob and Emily. But Jacob couldn't stay silent anymore. Wait, he called out, stepping forward despite the panic clawing at his chest. Jacob, what are you doing? Mr. Porter hissed. Jacob ignored him and yelled toward the door. If the locket is so important, then tell me why. What does it mean? Why did my grandpa have it? For a moment, there was no answer. Then the man's voice came again, quieter this time but no less menacing. Your grandfather stole something that didn't belong to him. That locket holds the location of something priceless. Something people like me are willing to do anything to get. Jacob's eyes widened. You're lying. My grandpa wasn't a thief. The man let out a bitter laugh. You think you knew him, kid? He was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And he didn't keep his promises. I've been looking for that locket for years, and now you've got it. So give it to me, or you'll end up paying for his mistakes. Jacob's mind spun. His grandfather's words, his constant warnings to stay strong, the way he had clutched the locket before handing it over, all of it suddenly felt heavier, darker. What happens if you get it? Jacob demanded. What does it unlock? The man's voice dropped, almost a whisper now. Power, wealth, everything he kept hidden. Before Jacob could process this, the door splintered further, and the intruder's foot came crashing through. Mr. Porter fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the sound deafening in the small room. I said, "Get back," the old man roared, stepping closer to the door. But Jacob had already made up his mind. He turned to Emily, who was still clutching the locket, her small hands trembling. "Give it to me," he said softly. "No," she whimpered. "He'll take it." "No," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the fear swirling inside him. "But if we don't give it to him, he won't stop. Trust me, I'll figure this out." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she reluctantly handed over the locket. Jacob clenched it in his hand, feeling its cold weight press against his palm. He stepped toward the door, holding the locket out. "If this is what you want, take it. But leave us alone." The man paused, his face partially visible through the crack in the door. For a moment, his expression softened, almost as if he regretted what he had to do. Then he reached for the locket, his hand trembling ever so slightly. But just as his fingers brushed against it, Jacob pulled back. "One condition," he said, his voice firm. "You tell me the truth about my grandpa." "Everything." The man hesitated, his dark eyes meeting Jacob's. Then he nodded. "Your grandfather. He was part of a group that hid dangerous artifacts. The locket, it's a key to one of their hiding places. He betrayed us when he kept it for himself. He thought he could protect his family, but all he did was put you in danger." Jacob swallowed hard, the weight of the words sinking in. His grandfather had been trying to protect them, but in doing so, he had left them vulnerable. "Now hand it over," the man growled, his patience clearly wearing thin. Jacob took a deep breath, then held out the locket again. This time, he let the man take it. As the cold metal left his hand, he felt a strange mix of relief and fear. The intruder stared at the locket for a moment, then stepped back into the rain. "You're lucky, kid," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "But don't think this is over." He disappeared into the night, leaving Jacob, Emily, and Mr. Porter standing in stunned silence. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the weight of the night still lingered. Jacob sat on the porch with Emily, watching the sun rise over the quiet street. "Do you think he's coming back?" Emily asked softly. Jacob shook his head. "I don't know. But if he does, we'll be ready." They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the sun cutting through the cold left behind by the rain. Despite everything, Jacob felt a small spark of hope. Whatever secrets his grandfather had kept, whatever danger lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: he would protect Emily, no matter what.